Hi, it's Pastor Andy, and I want to talk about freedom today. Freedom is an important word for us. It is an important word for us as Americans. The end of our national anthem, and the land of the free and the home of the brave. We talk about freedom right there, but the idea of freedom means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So what does it mean? Well, before I answer that, because again, I'm just going to give you my thoughts on it. But when we look at our nation, each election, there are some parties that promote more freedom than others. For instance, one of the parties that always has a candidate that gets some votes is the Libertarian Party, and they are about liberty. They are about freedom, both personally and publicly. That is a part of their platform. And of course, constitutionally, Americans are guaranteed religious freedom. That is another type of freedom that is important. But again, how we define freedom is important. Well, the same is true for the Bible. Galatians 5, for instance, says that Christ set us free so that we are free. For freedom, Christ has set us free is exactly what it says. So we must ask, well, free to do what? Is that freedom that we can do anything at any time in any place? Is that what Paul means in that verse in Galatians? Is that why Jesus came, was to completely make us free to do anything? Well, that is a part of the misconception that surfaces for us in Romans chapter 6, verse 1. Again, that stems from the first part of the previous sentence, which is Romans 5:20. People thought that grace, and particularly an abundance of grace, meant that full freedom was in order. But that was not Paul's premise at all. That is not at all what he was trying to communicate. Now, I'm going to give you a big fancy word, a big theological word. It's used outside of theology as well, but the word is antinomianism. Antinomianism. And what this word anti means against, we recognize that. Ism is the idea of a belief or a system of beliefs or something like that. And then in the middle we have the word nomian, which really comes from the Greek word nomos, which we are very familiar with if you know much about the Bible. You just might not know that you recognize this word. Nomos is the part of Deuteronomy, N-O-M-O. Nomos is what that means. Deuteronomy, deutero means second. The onomy is a part, or the nami is a part of law. So Deuteronomy means second law. It is the second giving of the law, the first part happening in Exodus and Leviticus, and parts of Numbers for that matter. So antinomianism is the belief of living free from the law, or against the law even. Specifically, this idea would relate to the law of God from a biblical perspective, and it permeated the thoughts of some people who taught and thought, I should say that backwards, who thought and taught that very principle. And so Paul rejects this idea in Romans 6, 1 and 2. Paul is not suggesting that the freedom that God's grace brings means absolute liberty. He is not saying that. Rather, it is a freedom to live differently. Specifically differently than what would otherwise be possible apart from giving ourselves to Christ. We see this in several passages in the New Testament. Let me just highlight a couple here, 3 specifically. So in Matthew 5, verses 17 through 19, is a lack of law, is not following the law important? Well, Matthew 5, 17 through 19, Jesus said he did not come to abolish the law, or the prophets for that matter, but he did not come to abolish the law. He came to fulfill them by perfectly obeying them. Now, we may not be able to perfectly obey the law. We sin, right? But if Jesus kept the law, why should we think we don't have to? The second verse I want to point you to, or verses, is Titus chapter 2, verses 11 through 14. And this brings grace into the picture. Paul says that grace came to train us, in part, to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in this life while we wait for the hope that we have in the next life, the hope of the blessed hope that Jesus will bring when he returns. Now, each of those descriptions is a moral description: self-controlled, upright, godly, are all moral descriptions of something, and morality, as defined by God, demands, I should say, some aspect of law keeping. So we have two. Let me look at one more for us. John chapter 14, verse 15. Now, some people might say, going back to the first one I mentioned, Matthew chapter 5:17, that Jesus did not come to abolish the law or the prophets. But so some people might say, well, see, Jesus kept those. And then, like in John, he says it is finished because he was able to keep those. So we are not bound to keep those. Well, that might be an argument. But even if that is your argument, you can't get past John 14:15, in which Jesus says on his last night with his closest followers, if you love me, you will obey, you will keep my commandments. Furthermore, in the Great Commission, Matthew 28:18 through 20, he says that teach others to observe all that I have commanded you. So it's not just the original disciples that were to love him and show that love by obedience, but they were to teach others to do the same thing. And that teaching has carried down now for nearly 2,000 years. So we cannot get past these ideas. And the three greatest commands that Jesus gave, love God, love neighbor, and love one another, are a part of those commands. We could also look at Romans 14 and perhaps a couple of other places, but ultimately, what Jesus has done is not made us free to do anything, anywhere, at any time. He has not made us to ignore the law. Rather, the freedom is, according to Romans 6:4, is that we are free to walk in newness of life. In other words, our freedom is being free from a prior sinful life. Christians have been set free from the bondage of sin in order to live a new life, a life to walk properly, which we can find in Romans 13:13, a life of love, Romans 14:15, and a life led by the Spirit, Romans 8:4, all of which we will see later. Therefore, it is not against any law. It is living in accordance to the law of Christ that we are now to live, Galatians 6:2. It is that we have been justified because of Christ, and we now learn to be sanctified in Christ or with Christ. Living with Christ is the truest freedom that we can know, both now and for eternity. But let's not wait for eternity to start being free. Let's begin living in freedom today.